Hi folks, it's Dr. DiBiase, and I'm going to talk about some good questions from the Muddiest Points assignments from the past couple of weeks. I had mentioned that, as part of our plan for doing these Muddiest Point questions, I was going to start to identify some of the stronger questions that I saw coming up in the responses, and sort of share the good work that people are doing, but also explain why I think the question works as well as it does, and things we might take away from the questions that we're going to see today as we're thinking about how to formulate questions in the future, not just for like the Muddiest Point assignments, but also if you're trying to demonstrate your ability to sort of ask a good question in any class. So let's start with the Tejada, Rue, and Cisneros questions that people posted. So this first question comes from Caroline in section 10. And I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I'm going to focus on the question, which really deals with, why is it that readings in sort of institutionalized settings like high schools are slanted towards male readers. So Caroline asks, do you think that the book choices are more tailored to male students because they are shown favoritism in the school system and they wouldn't be interested in feminist works? Or do you think it's because male students are considered to have a shorter attention span for a less intriguing book, don't have the intellect to keep up with Little Women and other feminist pieces? So there's a couple of things I like in this question. One is just Caroline's willingness to sort of admit at one point that she says, looking back, I may have jumped to a more hostile place than she was trying to bring awareness to. I think that's fine. Like I think that Rue is bringing up a really important issue, and it is okay to sort of feel impassioned about an issue that a writer is bringing up, and I kind of hope that the stuff that you read in this class gets you sort of riled up a little bit. Um, One of the reasons I like this question, beyond the fact that sort of framing it in terms of her initial response, is that that in this question there's some really specific options sort of laid out for us here that Caroline is really clearly thought through. Um, and so I think that was good. And again, like I actually, in my response, I don't think it's either or in this case, but I think that thinking through what the possibilities could be are important. I also like that. And again, this could have been expanded, but that's fine. I like that Caroline tries to answer her own question here a little bit, right? I feel like it wouldn't be the latter, but we don't completely know the perspective of school districts, right? So in theory, would I love for this to kind of expand on the answer? Sure. But I really do like that it was included in the question in this section. So I appreciate that question. The next three I sort of pulled together from three different sections, but they all have one thing kind of in common. So I'm going to run through them and I'll talk about what they have in common. So Avery in section 5 is asking, she's referring again back to the root piece, why a professor might say, or why a faculty member might say, I'm not gender biased, but I'm not going to assign this novel. So the question here is, why do teachers continue to uphold gender roles in literature in their lessons when they claim to be progressive? Julian in section 11 asks, I would argue a similar kind of question, and I'll explain why in a moment, about the Tejada piece, right? So how could the label of being, again, being labeled remedial cause the authors to both feel like they were at the bottom of the hierarchy, yet also causing them to work harder to become better writers? And Caitlin in section 32H, um, this is also sort of kind of grounded in the Tejada piece, although it could apply to a lot of the readings we've done. Asks, how can college professors and universities include texts such as writing about writing in their curriculum, but then continue to push harmful labels onto students? So the reason why I pulled these three questions together and really wanted to highlight them is that they all do the same thing. I would argue that each of these students has identified what I would call a tension in the reading, right? Some sort of contradiction that forces us as readers to want to open up another question, right? So in Avery's, right, there's actually a really clear contradiction. I'm not gender biased, but I'm not going to assign this novel, right? That there's a clear tension or contradiction there that we could explore and tease out. Um, in Julian's question, right, we have this situation where students are simultaneously um, have a negative response to being labeled remedial, and yet are able to demonstrate that they are, are into are intelligent people who can write, right? They are able to both, feel this sort of, it's hard to say what they're feeling, right? But this sort of sense of dissatisfaction with being labeled remedial, and at the same time, turn that around and use that to demonstrate their abilities, right? Use that as motivation for their abilities. And there's a conflict there, right? There's a tension in terms of, um, on on the one hand, they will sort of thrive in this environment in a particular kind of way, and yet it's really problematic that they had to go through the experience in the first place. And again, in Caitlin's, which is sort of adding this sort of large meta question, right? Is this tension, right? What does it mean to hear in these writing classes one thing, but then have professors treat writing like something very differently, right? And so all three of these students identified something in the readings that suggested a tension or a contradiction or some kind of conflict, or just something that felt out of place or doesn't quite add up, that leads us to want to ask follow-up questions or leads us to want to think harder about the nuance in what is being discussed. Now, turning to the Villanueva essay, we'll start with Nathaniel in section 32H, who asks about what can literacy institutions do to better promote literacies towards students such as Lopez and Villanueva in order to level the playing field between historically disadvantaged students and privileged ones. And what I really like about this question, um, the question itself is a good one in that it's sort of a big question about, literacy sponsorship at the institutional level. But what I really like about this question is Nathaniel's ability to pull together multiple works from the semester and identify some kind of recurring themes in the readings that we are seeing and use that as the jumping off point for the question. And I will often argue there's really no better way to impress a faculty member than showing that you can put a reading that you're doing for this week in conversation with readings or content that you've done in previous weeks, because it shows that you're not just like following along with the content, but that you're retaining that information and you're still thinking about it and you're seeing how one thing applies to something else. For Eileen, she was going to back to Villanueva and asking about how he describes rhetoric. Um, so this is a really interesting question for me because he says that rhetoric is studying humans, and then she wants to argue that it's more than just studying humans, but also the environment humans are in, etc. And actually, I think that in reality, Eileen and Villanueva are not that far apart here. But what I really appreciate about this question is Eileen going out on a limb to kind of call out the author and say, I feel like, something's off in his definition or there's something missing here. Now, I'm reading, Villanueva a little bit more generously, um, but I'll concede, right, that his phrasing is not as clear as maybe it could be. But I think it is important, right, as good critical thinkers to be willing to look at a writer, even a published writer, a more experienced writer, a writer who has a lot of kind of clout, uh, and be willing to push back a little bit, right? Even if it turns out that the gap between what you think and they think isn't quite as far apart as you might have thought on the first reading. Um, it's good to sort of stretch your cognitive muscles in that way and see what would it mean to sort of extend off of what the scholar says, right? So I agree with this, but I also think it's this other thing is actually a very common and important scholarly move that students can make. Emma in section 10 asks about this sort of, again, about the definition of rhetoric. So Villanueva writes that, quote, rhetoric would include everything that is conveyed through language, end quote, but also that, quote, rhetoric's classic definition as an art of persuasion suggests power. And so this actually falls kind of into the category of the previous questions, right? Because there's a tension here, or Emma sees a tension or feels a tension in that we have these two different definitions of the same concept. So how do we reconcile that, right? What does that mean for us at an intellectual level to take these two definitions and hold them together and see how they intersect with one another? And so the question, right, does there have to be a suggestion of power or persuasion for a piece to be considered rhetorical is important because on the one hand, Villanueva's first definition, or the first one that Emma puts here, is pretty broad, whereas the second definition is rather narrow. And so that led to what I hope was a good response on my part that sort of tries to reconcile these two. So again, looking for that tension in the content. Christopher also in section 5 identified a really cool tension, I think, in the Villanueva piece when Villanueva talks about his feelings that community college did not prepare him for what he would be expected to do when he got to when he transferred into the four-year institution. Um, and I also again appreciate Christopher trying to sort of build off of the question answered himself, right? So it seems to me that it would set him up for failure if he did things easily in community college, but in a good university, he had to relearn a lot of what he thought he knew. And again, my response to Christopher, part of the issue that Villanueva talks about here is that there was a tension even in the community college as to what its role is, but more importantly than that specific response is the fact that there's this feeling of things that don't fit right, right? Well, you would expect that if you're going from one institution to another, that it would prepare you, like that's the goal, as an institutional literacy sponsor, like what else is it doing? And so I really like how Christopher sort of identifies this sort of gap in sponsorship and this sort of conflict in sponsorship and wants to push that question a little bit further. So if we're going to do some takeaways here, right, and think about, what can we sort of take away from these questions or what we can think about in terms of, Muddy's points moving forward or think about in terms of how to frame a really good question for any class, right? If your professor says, come in prepared to talk about X reading, right? How you prepare a good question to bring into the classroom. Um, and this is not the be all and end all list here, but based on some of the things we looked at here, right? Trying to find moments of tension, right? Moments where pieces don't seem to quite fit together or where there seems to be some kind of contradiction can be a good starting point for pushing the conversation forward. Um, Try thinking beyond sort of A, B binaries, right? So sometimes it's not just this or that. So I think that establishing some options can be a good starting point, but trying to think about like what would it mean to go beyond that kind of framework. Try to refer to specific moments in the text. That can be really helpful for your professor or me in order to frame their response to your question, but it also shows that you are paying attention to really the specifics of the argument that's taking place. Try to put your question in the context of broader work, right? So like if you can connect a question about Mirabelli, for example, who you'll be responding to, this week, to stuff that we've talked about or read about with G or Brandt, or any of the other authors we've looked at, or other of the conversations that we've had, um, that really shows that you are operating at that higher intellectual level, right? That you are beginning to put the pieces together. And finally, and this is what I'm really going to ask you to try and do for this week, try to answer your own question, right? So like I think ask me the question that you want to understand, but also tell me how you're thinking about that question, right? Show me how you're trying to tease out the ideas that you're finding confusing or need more clarification. Um, First, because I think it's just a good exercise to do, right? It forces you to sort of think through your ideas and not just wait for a reply from me, but also by understanding how you're thinking through the question more clearly, it enables me to give sort of a more nuanced response as well. So I hope this was helpful to you. And again, I want to congratulate the people who I picked this week. I think you did a great job with your questions. And I'll be selecting more questions from the discourse Muddy's points from G last week, as well as the Mirabelli ones that you'll be submitting this week. So best of luck. I know you can do it, and take care.